Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second of today's events. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Christopher Hampton to Charleston, together with festival regulars William Nicholson and our chair for today, Rupert Christiansen. Rupert writes about the arts for the Daily Telegraph and has contributed to many newspapers and magazines, including The Spectator, Harper's and Queen, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker. His latest book was the devastating memoir, I Know You Are Going to Be Happy, released last year. Christopher Hampton is a British playwright, screenwriter, and film director. He is best known for his play and subsequent screenplay of Dangerous Liaisons, and more recently for his screenplay of the film adaptation of Ian McEwan's Atonement.
Nobody else.
No one else at all. Who are you again? His most recent work is Stephen Ward the Musical, for which he collaborated with Andrew Lloyd Webber. William Nicholson's plays include Shadowlands and Life Story, both of which won the BAFTA Best Television Drama Award of their year. He co-wrote the script for the film Gladiator, and more recently, he has scripted Les Miserables and Mandela. His new novel, Reckless, is partly inspired by Christine Keeler and the Profumo scandal. Please join me in welcoming all three to the Charleston Festival for what will undoubtedly be a fascinating session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And in the programme, it says that the subject of this talk is going to be Stephen Ward, but although he's our starting point, we're actually going to range further and wider. But let's start off by talking about Ward. He's this, as I expect you all know, this rather mysterious, alluring, ambiguous figure who was the victim of the Profumo affair and killed himself shortly before he was convicted for pimping. There are many different ways that you can look at this character, and Christopher, in your musical, and Bill, in your novel, you have taken different perspectives on him. Could you both talk a little bit about him? Perhaps Christopher first.
Well, I, of course, I was an adolescent during the Profumo affair, so I had the same memories as anybody of my age would have. And what was most interesting to me was how inaccurate those memories, those sort of folk memories of an event like that turn out to be. Stephen Ward, we quite early on fixed on Stephen Ward as the most interesting and sort of emblematic character, both in his own right and because of the drama of his fate, but also he was an emblematic character in being a kind of usher in to the swinging 60s. And so he was, from all kinds of perspectives, a fascinating figure. But what one remembers, I suppose, of the Profumo affair is that there was this girl, Christine Keeler. She had an affair with the Minister of War, and she had an affair with a Russian spy. Well, when you look into it, she did have an affair with the Minister of War, which lasted, a relatively brief 6 or 8 occasions, and over a year later, her lover of the moment, in a fit of rage, Johnny Edgecombe, fired some bullets into the front of Stephen Ward's osteopathic practice, and the whole thing blew up in the press. She probably, almost certainly, I would say, and this was what our research brought up, she almost certainly did not have an affair ever with Eugene Ivanov. The whole story really was invented by the News of the World, because at a certain point, we're already talking about something that was a year and a half in the past. Ivanov had been sent back to Russia. And imagine this girl given £25,000, an enormous sum in those days, brought in to talk to the News of the World, and, saying to them, Well, no, I never actually did have an affair with Ivanov. We used to get, we knew each other. We got drunk. We might have done something one night, but we were both too drunk to remember. The News of the World saying that's not the story we want. So, the government tottered and then fell. Stephen Ward was driven to suicide, all because of something that we know all about today. With the Leveson inquiry and all that sort of thing, is still going on, and so it was a very actually, what was interesting about it was the opportunity to do something unusual, which was to write a sort of campaigning musical, to say that what happened to Stephen Ward was one of the most conspicuous miscarriages of justice in England in the 20th century. And it's time we sort of became aware of that.
Bill, do you think it was entirely a stitch-up? Was he 100% innocent, or is there a sort of grey area? I mean, there is something slightly creepy about him, isn't there?
I think he was 100% innocent, absolutely, without any doubt whatsoever. I mean, I came to Stephen Ward by a different route. I wanted to write about a very pretty young woman. If any of you have read my earlier novel, Motherland, she's called Pamela, and she was aged 7 in that novel. She's now aged 18, and she's very pretty, and I was very interested. Everything I do begins with a sort of emotional idea, emotional charge. What would it feel like to be 18 years old and to know that you're very pretty, and to know that your life should be meaningful and exciting and adventurous, but you don't know how to do that? And in a sense, all you've got to offer is your prettiness. You haven't got any talent. This was her sense of herself. So she decides to go to London. And this was how my plot was devised. And then I asked myself the question, how can I develop an adventure for her when she gets to London? Now, there was a cafe called the Brush and Palette on, I think, the Edgware Road, something like that. And this was an artists' cafe where artists would go to sketch or to draw. And the attraction was a nude model. So the nude model, a totally naked lady, would sit on a stool in the middle of the cafe, and all of the artists, all of whom were male, would be sketching the nude model. And I suddenly thought, what a great way for my heroine, who's taken to the Brush and Palette by a friend of hers, to meet Stephen Ward, because I'd begun reading about Stephen Ward and realized that this was a guy who picked up pretty girls. And he was indeed there, but the thing that was crucial to me was everybody else was drawing the nude lady's nude body. He was drawing her face, and he was only interested in people's faces. He wasn't, I don't know whether Christopher would agree with this, in a way he wasn't a sexual being, despite the fact that there's a lovely story of him going to a brothel in Mexico as a young man, and the tart who took him off to the room came bursting out and knocked on all the other girls' doors, saying, "You must all come and see, you must all come and see this man's pinga grande." And apparently he had an enormous one. But I don't believe he was really a sexual being at all.
I think he liked prostitutes.
Well, having sex with prostitutes?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't up with that. In my book, Stephen Ward does not have sex with prostitutes. I suppose the sort of more interesting aesthetic question is whether...
Not necessarily more interesting.
In your desire to redeem him, to turn him into a victim, whether there isn't a danger of romanticising him,
well, I think
turning him into a hero.
I don't think we turned him into a hero, and I don't think we denied that he had certain, slightly creepy qualities. He was a snob. He was a snob. He
was a snob.
Yes, I accept that.
He loved hobnobbing with the elite. He loved boasting. He was a fantasist. But none of these things are any reason to drive a man to suicide. So I think, like many of us, he was not perfect, but he was a scapegoat.
Yes, he was. Have you ever had trouble legally with representing a historical figure? Either of you?
Well, I
Any
wrote...
sort of official complaints from
No,
people who knew them, or
I wrote a play, which was subsequently turned into a film, about the early years of psychoanalysis, which dealt with Jung and Freud, and with a love affair that Jung had with one of his ex-patients. And it was borne in on me that when the play was performed in Zurich, that the Jung family were less than delighted with this play, and that the Jung family now consisted of 5 enormous, strapping Swiss chaps, and therefore it was probably as well for me not to go to the first night. But in fact, and indeed they did raise some local protest. Some months, the play had been done in London at the National Theatre with Ralph Fiennes and a very good cast. Some months later, I was in Los Angeles, as we sometimes have to. We sometimes find ourselves there, despite our best efforts. And I was called out of an editing room to take a phone call, and I took the phone call, and the voice said, "Good afternoon, this is Fritz Jung." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, your disgusting play, which we went to see in Zurich, I hear is now going to be made into a film. And I want to tell you that we in the Jung family will do everything in our power." At which point I said, "Rafe."
And it was.
I did get a lawyer's letter about Stephen Ward as well, and that's part of the.
from who? On behalf of whom?
On
The
behalf,
nephew?
on
or-
behalf of Lady Astor,
Yes.
because Bill Astor, Lord Astor, didn't come out of our piece very well, in the sense that he, more or less abandoned, as all his friends and circle did. He more or less abandoned Stephen Ward and threw him to the wolves when trouble arose.
But I believe I'm right in saying, perhaps some legal eagle in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong, that you cannot libel the dead. And I'm wondering whether that means that as a writer, you feel you have liberty. You have liberty.
Before we get on to the dead,
Yeah.
and that is obviously
Yeah.
the more common experience writing about the dead, I must tell you a story which I may have told that some of you have heard before. When I wrote Shadowlands, I stupidly failed to think that C.S. Lewis, who died in 1963, 62, 63, that his stepsons, of course, would still be alive. And I didn't think this at all, and I wrote this story about C.S. Lewis for Shadowlands, C.S. Lewis's love affair with Joy, and her sons were still alive. The script was written, this was the TV version, the first version, and a chap turned up from Tasmania saying, "I am Douglas Gresham." And in the play, Douglas Gresham was a character in my play, and he was a boy of 9, and he has a crucial scene in the play and also in the film, which I know if you've seen it, right at the end when C.S. Lewis is racked with grief and he and the little boy are sitting side by side in the attic. And the little boy says, "Do you believe in heaven?" And Jack Lewis says, "Yes, I do." And the little boy says, "I don't." And Lewis says, "That's okay." And the little boy pauses and then he says, "But I sure would like to see her again." And at that point, for the first time, Jack Lewis cracks and starts to weep unbearably. So, in other words, a crucial scene. Douglas Gresham, now aged 62, shows up from Tasmania with a huge cross round his neck, saying, "How can you have this line saying, 'I don't believe in heaven'? I have been a passionate Christian all my life. You must change it." And I said to the producers, I can't change it. It ruins the whole end of the play. What are we going to do? So we said to Douglas Gresham, "We can't change it." So he said, "I will phone the Director General of the BBC and have this stopped. And the Director General was then a man called Alistair Milne. So he phoned Mr. Milne, and he got through to an engineer called Milne in the BBC, who said, as everybody in the BBC would have done, we take your complaint very seriously. It will, of course, be passed on to the appropriate authorities, and then forgot about it. And so that was that. We've shot the film. It was made with my script as it was. Douglas Gresham came to see it, sat all the way through it, and in the end he said, "Oh, now I understand. It's okay." So I said, "Will you write that down?" And he wrote a piece of paper which was put in the program of the stage version saying, "Nothing in this piece is true. However, it is the truest version of my mother's love affair that I have ever read." And that is a very interesting contrast. He understood, to his enormous credit, the difference between dramatic truth and legal truth. Yep.
So what comes first for you, dramatic truth or legal truth? I know what you're going to answer. Both of you.
Well, it's not quite as... I'm obviously dramatic truth, but I do think, and I've written a lot of fact-based drama of one sort or another, I do think that what really happens is always much more interesting than anything you could invent. So I do take a great deal of trouble to try to find out what actually happened. And I don't remember ever having been sort of disappointed by what you find. I wrote a play called Tales from Hollywood, and it's somewhere in the bowels of the German Institute in London. I discovered a yellowing piece of newspaper which explained that one of the main characters of the play, who was notoriously anti-Semitic, was actually Jewish. And, of course, this was something you would never have dared invent, but it was something that actually completed the play in the way Bill's just talked about. The scene that he wrote completed his play. And on the whole, I think reality is much more interesting than fiction.
But I must say something very important here, which people don't realize. I made documentary films for many years before I became a playwright or a screenwriter. By the way, I was trying to be a novelist at the time as well, and completely failing. But that's why I was making the documentary films. It was my day job. And I know, as a documentary filmmaker, that you can make a documentary film in which every scene is real, everything is exactly what happened, you haven't made anything up, but the result is completely false. It's a matter of what you select and how you put it together. So the challenge I would throw back at anybody who says you can't fictionalize real life is to say, we're doing it all the time. Every time somebody says to you, "How was your day, dear?" and you give them a version of your day, you are making up a story. And that doesn't make it false. It just means you're choosing what to select and how. I agree with Christopher completely. The real world is our material. It's better than anything we can make up. But we're selecting. We're selecting, we're giving it weight, we're creating, we hope, dramatic power. And in the end, the thing that we dramatists or writers have to do is give life. It's got to be alive. If it's dead, there's no amount of telling people, "But it really happened," that's going to help you. It's either alive on the page or in the theatre, or it's dead.
Bill, your novel, which is absolutely wonderful, total page turner, completely gripping, and I can't recommend it highly enough. That's heartfelt. It falls into this great sort of 19th century tradition, which starts with Walter Scott, goes through Tolstoy, through George Eliot, through to Hilary Mantel today, which is really, I would say, it's fictional recreation of factual history. That's how I would define it, in which fictional characters interact with actual historical events and actual historical personages. Now, what are the ground rules for this? Are there barriers beyond which you don't tread?
I use, as Christopher was implying, I use reality with as great a respect as I possibly can. This is a story that has the Cuban Missile Crisis as its frame. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 14, I guess. I was at a Catholic boarding school, and all the boys went to confession on the night of Saturday, October 28th, because we thought we were going to be dead the next day. I think a lot of you here will remember that night. I'm told, probably apocryphally, that the co-eds of Radcliffe came bursting out of the dorms, saying to every man they could meet, take me, I don't want to die a virgin." It really was. It's hard for us to realize now. It really was terrifying. So my reaction when I realized that the structure of the saga that I'm writing means that I was reaching 1962 for my character, Pamela, that there's waiting for me the most fabulous plot device, which is, will the world end? So that became a sort of structural thought. Once you decide on doing that, you then say, well, how am I going to show this? Am I going to show it in the microcosmic, delicate, restrained, reticent way of a spinster alone in her room hearing the news? No, forget that. Let's go to Khrushchev, let's go to Kennedy, let's go to Mountbatten, let's actually do this thing big. Damn it, if Tolstoy can do it, if Tolstoy can have Napoleon, I can have Khrushchev. So for the first time in my life, I've woven my characters, and those of you who've read my books before will recognize them, with major political characters involved in something that was of critical importance. And the thing that I was really wanting to do with this was to say to readers, don't you understand? The mistake you make in your marriage or with your friendships when you misunderstand what somebody is doing or saying, and you misunderstand it, by the way, out of fear and anxiety. We're always projecting onto other people. We think if somebody's staring at us that they're hating us. Perhaps they're short-sighted. Do you see what I mean? All the time we misperceive each other, and that is where novels are brilliant, because novels take you into each mind and the reader can understand these misperceptions. Well, my revelation was this happens on a global political scale, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was a classic example of this. The key actors did not know what the other people were actually up to. They misunderstood them, they read it in terms of their own fears, and it very nearly ended the world. So I thought, if I go in immense detail into this, and we're cutting back and forth between a girl having terrible sex with some friend of Stephen Ward's and getting into a terrific mess, and then suddenly we're in Moscow with Khrushchev trying to work out what to believe, and slowly the threads combine. And Christopher was talking about Ivanov, the Russian military attaché. He genuinely did, unless I've got this wrong as well, he genuinely did try to create a back channel to solve the problem. Stephen Ward was part of that attempt in total good faith, perhaps deluding himself, but he wanted to solve the problem. So I suddenly realized I could knit everything together, my characters who knew Stephen Ward, right the way through to Kennedy. And I've used three, a Russian, an American, and a Brit, from the very beginning, when they first have tea with Princess Elizabeth in Cliveden in 1942, which really happened. And I've allowed it to flower outwards to this enormous, terrifying global catastrophe. And should you read it, what I want you to say to yourself is, oh my God, people in positions of enormous power simply lack proper information. It's happening right now in Ukraine. People are immediately assuming that Putin wants to take over Ukraine and maybe take over the world like Hitler, as Prince Charles said. I don't believe that for 1 second. That's us projecting our fears. At the same time, NATO is creeping up to the borders, which makes Putin terrified. So I want to say, think like a novelist. Novelists go into the hearts and minds, not just of people having adulterous affairs in Hampstead, but of Napoleon or Kutuzov in War and Peace, my novel, and in my novel, Khrushchev, Mountbatten, and Kennedy. And you start to realize how important it is for us to think novelistically, think dramatically, which means thinking of the complexity of people's true motives. Sorry, it's a bit of a brand.
Is the do you in the sort of great pantheon of writers and thinkers, do you then put the novelist higher than the historian? Does Tolstoy rank for you above Thucydides?
Very, very much so.
Oh, no.
Yes. Historians, the thing about a novelist is the novelist can give you the heart and the mind. Now, I admit the novelist is making it up, and that's where you've got to be a great novelist.
Yes, that's why you can tell the truth, because you're
Exactly.
lying.
Well, you're not bound, you're not tied. You can say, what must it have felt like? I mean, I'm planning a novel now that's going to be set on May the 7th, 2015, and I'm going to go into the minds of Clegg, Miliband, and Cameron. Now, I don't know what they'll think about it, but I'm going to have a good shot at it, because we can say things that no journalist can say, because it's a novel, it's a story, it's not real, but actually you can get at the really, really important things. I passionately believe in the novel. People sometimes say the novel is dead. The novel is the only way. I mean, how do we know about other people's sex lives? For example, I write a lot about sex. Nobody is telling us.
You read the Kinsey report. Fact, fact, fact.
Do you believe the Kinsey report? Fiction, fiction, fiction.
I don't want to know what happened to American people reporting in 1949. I want to know about the person next door and what they're up to and what they're feeling about it and how difficult it is and how disappointing it is and how all of us think everybody else is having better sex than we are, and it's not true.
But what you're really telling us is what Bill Nicholson thinks the truth of the matter is.
That is true, but luckily there are more novelists than me.
How do you build up a historical novel, Bill? What's your starting point? What's the germ?
This is something I really do. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, he's coming.
I really do want to. I've been to a lot of the sessions here, and I keep on wanting to know from the novelists how did, why did you do that at all? And I think I just want to say very simply, for me, novels are about emotion. They're about very strong feelings. That's the bit that isn't reported externally, that can only be reported internally. All my novels begin from a moment of emotion. What happens if you're a young man and you love somebody and you finally summon up the courage to say, will you go out with me? And as you're saying it, you realize you've got it wrong. She doesn't want you. And you blush and you're humiliated and you withdraw. It's something, by the way, it's happened to me and probably happened to most of you. So that's a little moment of emotion. What happens if you're a very pretty girl and you've gone and got yourself out of your depth and somebody's asking you to do something sexually that you are absolutely terrified to do, but you realize you're going to do it? These little moments that actually I want as a novelist to explore. So that's how it starts. You start with the emotional moments. You then say, who are these characters? So next you build your characters. This is the way I work. You build your characters. I still don't have a story at this point. I have an idea. What happens if you're a girl who sees God, who sees Jesus in a vision? This is part of this story. At the age of 12. And now you're 29 and you think you made it up. But they've built a shrine around your visions. What do you do? So I get these little bits and pieces of ideas. And I start thinking, how can I fit them together? What are the characters? Then I build the characters, making a lot of notes. After I've built the characters, I then say, when does this happen? And I get to 1962. What happens in 1962? I start to find also, this is research, huge amount of research. So then the research comes in. And then, and only then, does the story start to form. I've got my characters, I've got my emotional germs, I've got my setting, and I've got a lot of information. And then all the little bits start slotting in like a jigsaw puzzle. This is an immensely complicated book, to be honest, because it's using the global scene as well. And you then put it together and you realize, now I can fly. Now I can start riding with these characters and getting to love them and letting them live and breathe within the frame that I've created. And that produces both a story and a world. Now, that's how I write novels. I think it's probably how most people write novels. I don't sit down and have a muse work straight through me. I don't start writing and let it all flow out. Not at all. I do a lot of preparation. And it is constructed. But at the end of the day, there's one thing I'm after, and that is truth. It's got to be true, by which I don't mean factually true, I mean emotionally true. You reading it have got to say, I believe that girl, I believe that guy, I believe they would behave like that. They are alive as I read. I care about them. You've got to have all those sorts of reactions. Nothing else will make you want to go on reading than that perception of, my God, how does he know that? How did he understand what I too have felt and thought? And if I'm any good at all, you're going to feel that when you read the book. And if I'm not, you're going to chuck the book away, and quite right too.
Christopher, does this make you feel that you might like to write a novel? It's something quite striking that in your 40-year career as a writer of fictions and adapter of fictions that you've never written a novel. Why is that?
Well, I did write a novel, actually, when I was about 16. And I sent it to every publisher in London and got rejections from all of them.
Was it about yourself?
So it was about, it was about school.
Teenage life.
Yes, all that stuff. One or two of the letters gave me some friendly advice. You seem very young, perhaps you should adopt some useful profession. Anyway, I was disappointed, obviously, because it'd taken me quite a long time to write this great thing. And when I sort of reflected on it, it seemed to, and I looked at it again, it seemed to me that the bits that really came alive were the dialogue. And the rest was rather sort of puddingy. So, with the arrogance of youth, I thought, well, I'll try a play. And I started to write a play. I was by now 18. And that went much better and seemed to come much more naturally. So I always thought, well, it'd be rather nice to write a novel in dignified old age. But for the time being, I still think of myself as writing for actors. That's really what I feel my profession is, writing for actors. I've enjoyed it very much.
And specifically this process of writing a musical is very interesting to me. Stephen Ward this year and Sunset Boulevard, what was that, 10, 15 years ago?
20.
With some of the same collaborators. And it is, of course, an intensely collaborative process in the way that writing a novel is a very solitary process.
Yes. Well, that's actually, of course, part of the enjoyment of what I do is that unlike a pure novelist who writes alone and gets out to this sort of occasion and does a few interviews when the books are published, if you write drama, it comes in two phases. That's to say, you write the thing, and then you get to work on it with actors. You get to go to rehearsals. You get to cast the right actors to play the parts. You get to, eventually, if you feel like it, direct the thing. So that there's a whole sort of social side to the job as well as the solitary grappling with a bit of paper.
But presumably that's not always convivial.
Well, just to talk about Stephen Ward. It's rather unusual. It's rather unusual working with Andrew, I think, because Andrew Lloyd Webber, because he's very swift and decisive. And what happened was that we all went in. Don Black and I went in for a meeting with him, and he said, "The Profumo affair. Do you think that's an interesting subject for a musical?" And within half an hour, I suppose, we'd narrowed it down to Stephen Ward, to writing about Stephen Ward. I produced a sort of synopsis rather quickly, and then Andrew started writing the music. So he wrote the music before he had any text in front of him. He just
did you do as much research as Bill would have done?
I did. We did.
I think you did more, probably.
We did it. Well, the research took the form of meeting as many survivors as we can. So that, for example, there was a Hungarian refugee barrister who was the one who said to us early on, he said, I don't think Christine Keeler and Ivanov slept together. And we said, well, what do you mean? How? And he said, well, Ivanov was a friend of mine, and he was prone to boasting, he said. He said, and what he said to me was, she sleeps with everybody else, why doesn't she sleep with me? So that seemed pretty convincing. And so, anyway, Andrew writes the music, and then Don and I write the lyrics to the music, and then...
In the same room with each other?
Oh, yes, kicking it around.
Kicking it around.
Rhyming dictionary, all that. And then I write, and then the book, so-called book of the musical, which is the dramatic bits, you stitch together. Now, it isn't quite as smooth as that because, of course, you will go back to Andrew and say, look, we're missing something here. Could you provide us with another song here? Or, and sometimes he'll play something. We hijacked the final song, which is Stephen Ward singing about while he's committing suicide. We didn't have a piece of music for that. And one day we were round at Andrew's and he played a piece of music and said, I don't quite know where that's going to go, and in fact, I don't really think it fits in this musical at all. And I said, I think that's the very tune we've been looking for. And he said, no, I think I'll save it for, another musical later on. And so Don and I left. We went straight to Don's place. We wrote the lyric, and we got it back to Andrew by the evening and said, this is the lyric. And he said, oh, you're quite right, yes, fine. And so because of his particular position, Andrew, and the fact that he is who he is, you don't have to go through that enormous development period that you hear about with musicals where they're 5 years or 10 years, or from the time the idea first came up to the opening night was about 18 months, which is really quick for a musical. And there was a great sense of forward momentum. There were no I'm disappointed to tell you, tantrums or outrages of any kind.
Pity.
People got a bit jumpy a few days before the opening, but that's usual. And Richard Eyre directed it, and we all got on very well with him. I mean, we did all feel that we ought to, at one point it was mooted that the production company should be called Bus Pass Productions, because we were all of a certain age. But we had a great time. We had a lovely time, and I was very proud of the result.
Bill, is one attraction of writing novels for you, because you spend most of your life as a scriptwriter, the fact, though, that you can retain total creative control over this delicate process?
Just to correct you, I spend most of my life writing novels. I write the screenplays as fast as I can. But yes, you're completely correct. I love writing novels, and I'm paid to write films. It's basically the way it works. I cannot make a living writing novels. Some people do who are more successful than me, but my loyal readership, both of you, will know that that this will not keep me in the pennies. So I write the films, and I'm excited by writing the films, but it's a brutal, brutal world, as Christopher will know. And it's not a world that you want to go into unprotected. And the novels are my protection, because when I come back to the novels, which is where my mind lives, it is, as Rupert says, it's my world to control, for better or ill, because that can be a terrible trap. If you're left alone without people telling you you're going wrong or writing badly, you can go seriously wrong. And I would say all the best novelists who've been acclaimed go on to write progressively worse books because people stop controlling them and editing them. And luckily I haven't reached that stage yet, so I'm well edited and controlled. But actually, before we stop, there's a little something I want to do from here.
Yes.
Can I do it?
Yes.
This is just a little amusing thing, because this is a literary festival and you're all such well-read types. It will amuse you to know that I discovered in my research that while the Kennedy clan were dealing with the crisis, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a particular point at which Khrushchev had written a big letter saying, okay, I'll withdraw the missiles. He'd got panicked. He then wrote a second letter immediately after it saying, no, I won't unless you withdraw your Turkish missiles. So they had letter number one, which appeared to give them the capitulation they want, and letter number two, which didn't, which said, you've got to withdraw the Turkish missiles as a quid pro quo, which they didn't want to do. So this is Bobby Kennedy came back into the room brandishing a book. Remember this, Jack? Another book, said Kennedy. Great. You read it last summer, The American Senator by Anthony Trollope. Summer before, said Kennedy. Bobby had the book open at a marked passage. By the way, this actually happened. You told me about this back then. We called it the Trollope ploy. The Trollope ploy. What the fuck is this, Bobby? Arabella Trefoil is desperate to get Lord Rufford to marry her. They go for a ride in a carriage, they're alone together and they're flirting. He kisses her, but she can't get him to the point. He read from the book. She flung herself onto his shoulder, and for a while she seemed to faint. For a few minutes she lay there, and as she was lying, she calculated whether it would be better to try at this moment to drive him to some clearer declaration, or to make use of what he had already said without giving him an opportunity of protesting that he had not meant to make her an offer of marriage. Bobby looked up with a grin. You get the strategy? She hasn't received her proposal, but she decides to act as if she has. When she gets home from the carriage ride, she simply tells her mother that Lord Rufford has proposed, and he's caught. Summer's over, guys, said McNamara, impatient with this distraction. What do we say to Khrushchev? We answer, said Bobby, the first letter and act as if we never got the second letter. Now which is exactly what they did. Now this is how Khrushchev and his team received that second letter. What about my second letter? What about the missiles in Turkey? He says nothing about that, said Troyanovsky. Why not? This is Khrushchev. Why not? I don't understand. I think this is what we call the Kuryagin ploy, said Troyanovsky. It's a very literate audience. He pretends to have received from you the offer he wants. Khrushchev stared at him. You'll remember, Chairman, in War and Peace, how the father of the lovely Helene Kuryagin becomes frustrated by Pierre's slowness in making a marriage proposal. In the end, the father bursts into the room and congratulates the young couple just as if the proposal had taken place. Pierre is too embarrassed to object. Yes, of course. Khrushchev had not read War and Peace. He knew only that Helene Kuryagin's most famous attribute had been her magnificent bosom. Nobody dazzles me with tits, he said. This is all a catastrophe. We can't have a war over Cuba. It's out of the question. You know why? Cuba is not our homeland, Chairman. No, because we'd lose. Now, the second half did not happen. The first half did. But as soon as I read about the Trollope ploy, I thought of that scene from War and Peace, and I thought somebody was bound to have said this to Khrushchev. It's such a beautiful parallel.
Now, of course, the interesting question is whether Tolstoy read Trollope. I mean, Trollope certainly couldn't read any Russian, but Tolstoy read English, and I think The American Senator is a very late novel of Trollope's.
So do you think Tolstoy stole it?
Could be.
There's a ploy. I think Tolstoy's version is infinitely better than Trollope's version. I mean, that scene, if any
He
of you
stole it
remember
and improved it.
He stole it, exactly. It's what we do, isn't it?
Hopefully.
Christopher, Bill was saying how much he loved writing fiction. Do you love writing screenplays?
I didn't love writing anything. I always wanted to be a writer for reasons I can't possibly explain, because I just don't know why I wanted to be a writer. I've always found writing very, very effortful. And like Bill, I tend to spend much more time planning things than actually writing them. And I love all that. I love the research. But there comes a terrible moment when you have to sit down and write the thing. And I always dread it, and it never gets any easier. In fact, the more you know, of course, about anything, the harder it gets. So no, I don't. I'm afraid. There are rumors. Lytton Strachey said, "I hear rumors that there are people who enjoy writing. Who can these people be?"
Bill?
Well, I understand exactly what Christopher is saying. It's a funny thing. It's a sort of compulsion, I think. I don't know if you feel that. I feel if I haven't written on any day at all, and I'm obliged not to write, for example, on Christmas Day by my family, the rest of the time I write. And I feel like I haven't cleaned my teeth, or something like that.
Yes, John Updike said he counted a day on which he hadn't written 1,000 words as a wasted one.
I finished my last play on Christmas Day.
He's even more compulsive than me.
Before lunch or after?
No, before lunch.
That's important.
It's a very odd thing. It's always scary every single day, and it's always exhilarating. Not every single day. Sometimes it doesn't work and you feel bad. But I bet there's a lot of writers here, and anybody who is a writer knows that it's a sort of drug. that there's something about, I suppose it's like being God, there's something like about creating a moment or a character that is intoxicating. And that's what keeps us all going despite the brutality of the life. I mean, it is really, really tough. Because first of all, nobody wants to know. Then they don't want to publish your work or show the films or whatever. Then eventually they do, and then everybody's rude about it. So, I mean, you know, why do we keep going? I don't know.
Thirst to be abused.
Do you think
I'll tell you what, I don't think it is
yes.
thirst to be abused. I think actually it's showing off. I think it's a fundamental showing off. I think when I was a little tiny boy, I wanted my mummy and daddy to say, "Aren't you a clever boy?" And I think it's been going on like that ever since.
I tried to write a novel once and gave up after about 30,000 words because I couldn't do I realised I just couldn't do dialogue. So I'm wondering, Christopher, or Bill, in fact, whether you could tell me what the secret is.
I think it's a musical thing. I think it's something in your ear I I'm particularly interested in people's turns of phrase and the way they express themselves and the way they conceal what they want to say by what they do say, and so on. And for example, one of the things I've always spent a lot of time parallel to my own work, but in translation work, because I was trained as a linguist. So I translate plays. And when I translated a couple of plays by Yasmina Reza, Art and God of Carnage, I found myself doing two different versions. A version for an English audience, in English, and a completely different version for an American audience, in American. And you'd be surprised how differently the two texts read, and that was sheer pleasure. I did enjoy that. I did enjoy finding the exact turn of. I remember when I first wrote a script for American actors, the thing that worried me most was, will they buy the fact that it's American dialogue? So I was very, very anxious about that, and was very surprised that in fact what they didn't like was all the usual things about the plot and the characters and so on and so forth. Nobody ever mentioned a word about the language. So I guess that was something I could do.
Bill,
I
do you
think
read a dialogue out loud when you're writing it? Do you test it on the tongue, as it were?
Sometimes, but I would answer your question in a slightly different way. I think it's all to do with character. If you really know the character you're writing, I find you don't even think about the dialogue. You become them and you speak. And if you don't really know the character, it doesn't work. And you find yourself stumbling all the time. I mean, I don't shop around for turns of phrase.
Well, technically, one thing you have to watch. I mean, listen, there are two kinds of playwright. There are playwrights like Harold Pinter who have a style, and they write in a particular style, and then there are people who try to avoid that. One of the things I try and do, which is just a technical exercise, is I give different characters different turns of phrase. Just because that's the way obviously when there's 6 people in a room, everybody has their own individual way of speaking. And somehow that's, for me, an amusing technical exercise to give people a slightly different cast of language, each character. And I think a lot of playwrights, dramatists, don't bother with that. They're more interested in the character and what they're saying and so on and so forth. But I really enjoy all those sort of little bits of technical buffing.
I think that's a very good tip. I'm going to have that.
And do you write your dialogue differently, do you think, in your novels than you do in your cinema or television or theatrical work?
I don't think so. The only difference is space. Yeah. I mean, an average book is 10 times the length of an average film screenplay, which is why it's so difficult to adapt a book, because you have to lose so much. So in a book, or to a certain extent in a stage play, you can have big speeches. It's very, very hard to put a big speech into a movie. I mean, I wrote one movie, and I won't name it, but the star was a fine actor, but with limitations. I was rung up during the course of the production and told, the speeches you've written for X, they're great, but could you reduce them all to one sentence each? He's having difficulty with anything over a sentence long, which screwed the entire thing.
That musical analogy you mentioned, Christopher, is very interesting. Do you have music on in the background when you're writing? Do you listen to a lot of music?
I love music, and I
Yes.
do listen to a lot of music, but not when I'm writing,
Not when you're writing.
because if I'm listening to music, I prefer to listen to music, and I find it I need to concentrate on the writing if I'm writing.
Music's a very interesting question. I like Christopher, I couldn't possibly listen to music while I'm writing, but the minute I stop writing, which happens at about 5 to 1 each day, I do not work in the afternoons. So I do work every day. I work weekends and everything, but I do not work in the afternoons. So I'm really a part-time writer. But what I do in the afternoons is I lie on a sofa and I listen to music. And what happens when I'm lying on the sofa? Well, I'm exhausted, you know? Give me a break. So I lie on a sofa and I listen to music. And unlike proper musical people who will say, I'm going to listen to Tristan and Isolde, I like to listen to the radio because I like different things to come up that I'm not planning. And the effect it has on me is every piece of music has a different emotional effect. And I'm listening to a bit of music, and perhaps it's got a martial beat to it. And suddenly I start thinking, that chapter, of course, it should have more of this happening, more drive to it, more action. Or perhaps I'm listening to a very, very serene piece of melody, and that gives me a different emotional effect. And all the time, all the ideas that have been hanging around in my brain start to float to the surface as I lie on my sofa. So when the family says, you're having a sleep, aren't you? I say, I am not. This is creative. I'm working. And it is. And it astounds me how even when driving, music will trigger different states in me.
I'm very envious of this finishing by Graham Greene, of course.
You can do it, why not?
Graham Greene, of course, famously finished his day's work before breakfast.
But getting up when?
6. And then he would write, and at 8:30 he'd have done his 500 words or whatever it was, and that was it.
So do you work all day?
I limber up.
Be more specific.
I tend to spend the morning looking at what I wrote yesterday and correcting it and...
And looking out of the window.
No, I don't do much of that anymore. Used to. But phone calls and stuff. Because everybody has different biorhythms, and I prefer to work in... my work hours are sort of between 2 and 7.
Yeah, it is exactly what you say. It's the biorhythm. I also limber up, but only for about half an hour. And then I have a peak moment that I hit between about 7:30 and 10:30, and that's really when it happens.
Gosh, when do you start?
It's about 6-ish. So.
No, then you're entitled to be over by... Give up.
Well, that's my
finish
point.
by 1.
This is a hangover from the days, by the way, when, like Christopher, I was writing novels when I was young, which I'm sure his was brilliant. Mine were absolutely not brilliant. So I had to do something else, and I worked at the BBC. And in those days, when the BBC was run like a proper organisation, you didn't come in until 10. And so I had until 10, and I lived very close to the BBC, very deliberately. So I got up at 6, and I could get in 2.5 hours' work on my great novels, which were going to make me famous by the age of 22. I think you were famous by the age of 22.
Probably more famous then than I am now.
Well, on that note, I'd like to bring this very amusing conversation to an end, or rather, I'd like to throw it open to the audience, because I bet you've all got hundreds of questions you'd like to ask Christopher and Bill. This lady here, Susan.
This is a question for Christopher, which you may decline answering. What do you think went wrong with Stephen Ward, the musical?
Well, it's a very good question, actually. I don't think anything went wrong in the sense, except that we were a little arrogant about the size of the audience from day one. In other words, if we'd been sensible, we probably would have tried to open it at the Donmar or the Almeida, or actually Nicholas Heitner came to the first night and said, "Why didn't you give it to us for the Cottesloe?" And if we'd done that, then it might have expanded naturally. Instead of which we opened the week before Christmas in an enormous theatre with no name actors, and a subject matter and a title that maybe didn't make people think this is something I want to go and see. Having said all that, I think it's a particularly difficult moment for musicals at the moment. I mean, the Full Monty musical, which got fantastic reviews, closed in 5 weeks. The Simon Cowell musical, which I'm afraid I missed.
And the Tim Rice one.
From Here to Eternity.
Yes,
Tim Rice
and From Here to Eternity, yes. There's been half a dozen or more musicals that have just slipped off the... because you have to have an enormous audience to run a musical, because it's very, very expensive to run. So if you don't have... we were full of from Thursday, Friday, Saturday, but Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday we weren't full, and therefore we were, the theatre was losing money every week. Andrew was terrible, of course, being used to 20-year runs and all the rest of it, was terribly, terribly upset. I am also doing an opera at the moment with Philip Glass, and I said to him, my musical's finishing, and he said, how long did it run? I said, well, we did 120 performances. He said, I've never had 120 performances.
Another question.
Going back to the point that was made earlier about the difficulty of adapting people's lives when their family and friends are still around, I think it's the obvious question for Charleston is, did Christopher Hampton run into any difficulties when he was writing the screenplay for Carrington?
Carrington, there was I think Francis Partridge, who was the only person that I met from the, as it were, from the cast of characters that I was writing about, was ambivalent about the whole thing, and I think she wrote about being ambivalent about it, mostly because the character of her husband, Rafe Partridge, she didn't, was taken largely from letters and diaries and Michael Holroyd's enormous and wonderful biography, and she objected to the characterization of her husband. My only defense was to say, well, all these scenes actually happened before you met him. In a sense, my guess is as good as yours. But I felt completely sympathetic to the fact that she was unhappy with the way her husband was portrayed in the film. And there wasn't really anything I could do to make it better. She did come and see the film, and she was very, she was an extremely gracious woman. So she did her best to accept what had happened. But I don't think she was happy about it.
Another question over here.
Question for Christopher. You were talking about translating other people's works. Do you translate literally 100% as they have written, or is there a difficulty in that you're bound to put your own twist on it?
I try to translate. I only really translate plays that I think are really good, and I try to translate them as faithfully as I can. However, what happens in different languages is kind of incalculable. And I remember the first preview of Art, Yasmina Reza, who had come over to London, and who at that stage did not speak terribly good English, was sort of horrified by the amount of laughter in the theatre. And the more the audience laughed, the more I could feel her sort of simmering beside me. And at the end, she turned to me and said, "What have you done to my play?" To which the answer was, "I made it very, very successful."
Another question, please. At the back.
You've both described when you work at writing. You haven't told us where. Do you like to have the same room, the same surroundings? Do you like to have familiar objects? Or do you go and sit in the garden on a sunny day?
In my case, I do write in the same place. and I really can only write there. But that's not because there's anything special about the place. It's because of all the equipment. And the equipment is mostly paper, by the way, and books, but particularly when I was working on this, which has an immense amount of reference in it, I have an enormous desk. It's not really a desk, it's like a shelf that goes around two sides of the room, and a chair on wheels, so I can wheel about, and I can get to the different things without having to stack them. They're all open at the same time. And I have a visual memory of where everything is. And around one corner is the computer. I write with a pen, so I handwrite. And only later does it go onto the computer. But I have to go to the computer when I suddenly think, oh my God, what does such and such a building look like? And of course, you know, Google Earth can now show you. So I'll zoom around there and look at it. So I can't do a J.K. Rowling and sit in a cafe in Edinburgh doing it. I wish I could. And even when I go to, you know, a place where I'm going to be on holiday, I find it difficult. So I am anchored, but I'm anchored by the gear, I think, not by anything else.
Christopher, do you tap, 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 and is your
No,
iMac an unmitigated blessing?
No, I don't think any of that's an unmitigated blessing, and I write by hand also. But my methods have changed in recent years because I always used to get to a stage just after sort of between half and two-thirds the way through something when I could see the end of the tunnel, as it were. And what I used to do was go abroad and take a hotel room and sit in the hotel room until I'd finished it, which would take another week or 10 days. There were all sorts of reasons for doing this. One, nobody knew where I was. There was no phone. There was no sort of familiar surroundings. I could really concentrate on what I was doing. And furthermore, because the hotels were often rather expensive, the quicker you did it, the sooner you could get home. Now, about 7 or 8 years ago, I bought a little place in the country, and now I go there, and it's not quite so rackety as it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Patrick. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, two, we'll take two more. Yes. Thanks. Patrick.
So,
Astor was famously generous as a man, and I think he also funded Stephen Ward's defence.
Sorry.
That was a question about Lord Astor and that he was famously generous and that he funded Stephen Ward's, to a certain extent, funded his defence. And all that is perfectly true. And in the scene that I wrote that his widow objected to, what he couldn't bring himself to do was to go and testify in favour of Stephen Ward, and there was a sort of meeting of Stephen Ward's friends in which Bill Astor said, "Well, I'd rather not go. I'd rather not appear," and Stephen Ward was very debonair about it at first. He said, "Well, of course not. Of course you don't want to bother yourself with all that," because the charges were so ridiculous that he was confident. Like Oscar Wilde, he went into the trial absolutely certain that he was going to win. But the fact of the matter is that there was this moment where Astor turned up. Stephen Ward thought he'd come as a sort of gesture of support, but Astor had come to get back the keys of the cottage at Cliveden, so that Ward wouldn't go there anymore. And it was a betrayal, and it was a betrayal that the judge seized upon, and in his summing up on the evening that Stephen Ward went home and committed suicide, he said, "You will notice that despite the many distinguished friends that the defendant claims to have, not a single one of them has turned up to speak on his behalf in court." So you're absolutely right that he was I think a kindly and generous man, but had an attack of cowardice, I think, at as many of us would have done at that particular juncture.
Thank you. A gentleman over here wanted to ask a question.
just a question for Christopher. In as much as you co-wrote, as I understand it, with Don Black, the lyrics and the book for Stephen Ward, you're both wordsmiths in your own right. How does the actual process of collaboration work?
Very, very. It's actually wonderful to write with someone else, which I've never done before in other circumstances. And it happened because I was asked to write the book of Sunset Boulevard. And I said to Andrew, but as I understand it, you've never written a musical with a book. What I would like to write the lyrics. And he said, no, well, I've asked Don Black to write the lyrics. And I said, well, look, I don't know what... he said, well, listen, have lunch with Don. So we went off and had lunch together, and I liked him very much. And he said, well, let's do it together. So we started and found it, you know, we literally sit on either side of his snooker table and throw ideas at one another, and it's tremendously good fun. And Don said the most wonderful thing to me. The first day we sat together to work on Sunset Boulevard, he said, you know, because he is a pure lyricist, a songwriter. He said, let me tell you one thing about writing songs. I said, what's that? He said, well, if you sit down at 10 o'clock to start writing a song and you haven't finished by 6, you're an idiot.
On that point, Bill Nicholson, William Nicholson, and Christopher Hampton, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, I'd like to thank Bill and Christopher as well for some amazing insights. If there are any aspiring writers of any form or genre in the audience this afternoon, what a fantastic privilege. You know, you've been given tips about writing novels, writing musicals, writing plays, writing for the cinema. What more could you ask? And thank you so much, Rupert, for guiding us through the session. So I'm going to take Bill and Christopher to the bookstall, where both of them will be signing books. But just before I do so, just a couple of notices. One, would you mind remaining seated while I take them out so they don't get mobbed? They don't mind being mobbed when you bring them their books to sign, but not just at the moment. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this event, Kevin and Prudence Watts. Thank you very much. That's it's very generous and very welcome. Finally, to say, is there an owner here of a grey Volkswagen estate with the number plate FV55 DFA? If there is, you've left your lights on. Okay, thank you very much once again.